Here is a number that should bother you. 78% of people live paycheck to paycheck, including people who make six figures, including people who look, from the outside, like they have it all figured out. Let that sink in for a second. It is not about income. If it were about income, raises would fix everything, but they don't. People get raises, and within months, they are right back where they started, spending more, saving the same, or less. So if it is not income, what is it? Today, we are going to talk about the real reason most people stay broke, not the reason in the textbooks, the reason nobody wants to look at directly. Because once you see it, you cannot pretend you don't. This is the bigger picture. Let me tell you about a pattern, one that repeats so consistently across so many different incomes, so many different countries, so many different generations, that it stopped being a coincidence a long time ago. Here is how it goes. Someone gets a raise or a promotion or starts a side business that finally takes off. For the first few weeks, it feels incredible. More money in the account, more breathing room, the sense that things are finally starting to change. And then something happens. Almost without noticing, life expands to fill the new space. The car that was fine yesterday suddenly feels like it is time for an upgrade. The apartment that worked perfectly well starts to feel a little small. The restaurants get a little nicer, the vacations get a little longer, the subscriptions multiply. None of these decisions feel reckless in the moment. Each one, individually, feels completely reasonable. You earned it, you deserve it, you can afford it now. And that is exactly the problem. Because 6 months later, the raise that felt like it would change everything has changed nothing. The bank balance looks almost identical to before. The stress about money is still there. The feeling of being one unexpected expense away from trouble never went away. This pattern has a name: lifestyle inflation. And here is what makes it so dangerous. It is invisible while it is happening. Nobody wakes up one day and decides to spend their entire raise. It happens one decision at a time, one upgrade at a time, one "I deserve this" at a time. Each decision reasonable, each decision small. And the sum of all those reasonable small decisions is a financial life that never gets ahead, no matter how much the income grows. Now here is the part that most people never connect. Lifestyle inflation is not really about money, it is about identity. When your income increases, your sense of what is normal for someone like you increases with it. The car you drive, the neighborhood you live in, the way you spend your weekends, these things become markers, signals, not just to other people, but to yourself. They become part of how you understand who you are. And here is the trap. Once your spending becomes part of your identity, reducing it doesn't feel like a financial adjustment. It feels like a demotion. It feels like admitting something about yourself that you don't want to admit. Which is why people will go to extraordinary lengths, take on debt, work additional hours, stress about money constantly, rather than simply spend less than they did last year, even when spending less would solve the actual problem. This is the real reason most people stay broke, not because they don't earn enough, not because they don't work hard enough, because their spending is tied to their identity, and their identity grows automatically with every increase in income, which means the gap between what they earn and what they spend never widens, no matter how much the first number grows. And here is what makes this especially relevant for people in their 30s, 40s, and 50s. This is the exact period when income tends to peak. Career advancement, salary growth, the years when earning potential is highest. And it is also, for most people, the period when lifestyle inflation is most aggressive. The house gets bigger, the cars get nicer, the commitments multiply. Which means the years with the greatest potential for wealth building often become the years with the least actual progress, not because the opportunity wasn't there, because it was consumed, one reasonable decision at a time. by a version of normal that kept expanding to match whatever was coming in. In the next part of this conversation, we are going to talk about why this pattern is so hard to break, even for people who can see it clearly, and what actually has to change for it to stop. If lifestyle inflation is so well documented, so widely understood, so frequently discussed in financial content, why does almost nobody escape it? The answer is not lack of information. Most people, by their 30s or 40s, have heard some version of this concept before. They know intellectually that spending tends to rise with income. They have read the articles, they have nodded along with the podcasts, and yet here they are, living it anyway. So let's talk about why. The first reason, though, is that comparison is no longer occasional, it is constant. A generation ago, your sense of normal was shaped by the people physically around you, neighbors, co-workers, family, a limited, local, relatively stable reference point. Today, your sense of normal is shaped by everyone. Every scroll through a phone is a parade of other people's homes, vacations, purchases, and lifestyles, presented without context, without the debt behind them, without the financial stress that often funds them. And your brain, which evolved to use the people around you as a benchmark for what is normal and acceptable, cannot easily distinguish between your neighbor and a stranger on a screen. It absorbs all of it as data about what normal looks like, which means the benchmark for normal spending, for normal lifestyle, for normal success has become almost limitless. There is always someone with more, always something newer, always a version of life that looks one step ahead of wherever you currently are, and chasing a benchmark that has no ceiling is a race that cannot be won, it can only be left. The second reason this pattern is hard to break is that the alternative feels like loss. Here is what I mean. If you have spent the last several years living at a certain level and you decide to scale back, it does not feel neutral. It feels like you are giving something up, like you are moving backward, like the life you have built is somehow being diminished, even if, mathematically, the change is small. Even if, practically, you would barely notice the difference day to day. The feeling of loss is disproportionate to the actual impact, and humans are wired to avoid loss, even more strongly than they are wired to pursue gain. This is one of the most well-established findings in behavioral economics. The pain of losing something is felt roughly twice as intensely as the pleasure of gaining something of equal value, which means reducing your spending by a meaningful amount feels emotionally like a much bigger sacrifice than the numbers would suggest, and that emotional weight is enough to keep most people from ever making the adjustment, even when they know, clearly, that the adjustment would change their financial trajectory. The third reason, and perhaps the most overlooked, is that nobody around you is likely to notice if you change. This sounds like it shouldn't matter, but it matters enormously. When you upgrade your lifestyle, people notice. The new car gets comments, the renovated kitchen gets compliments, the vacation photos get likes. There is social reinforcement for spending more. But when you decide to drive your car for 3 more years instead of upgrading, when you choose not to renovate, when you skip the trip that everyone else is taking, nobody notices. There is no social reward for restraint, which means the behavior that actually builds wealth is invisible, and the behavior that actually erodes it is celebrated. Put these 3 forces together: a benchmark for normal that has no ceiling, a psychological wiring that makes reduction feel like loss, and a social environment that rewards spending while ignoring restraint. This is not a willpower problem, this is an environment problem. And trying to solve an environment problem with willpower alone is why so many people who genuinely want to change their financial trajectory find themselves year after year in exactly the same place. In the next part of this conversation, we are going to talk about what actually works, not motivation, not discipline as a personality trait, something more durable than both of those. So if willpower is not the answer, what is? Let me tell you about the people who actually break this pattern. Not the ones who white-knuckle their way through months of deprivation only to rebound harder the moment life gets stressful. The ones who genuinely, permanently shift their financial trajectory. What they have in common is not more discipline, it is a different relationship with the decision itself. Here is what I mean. For most people, every spending decision is live. The upgrade, the subscription, the dinner out, the vacation. Each one is evaluated in the moment against the backdrop of, can I afford this and do I deserve this and everyone else is doing this? And in that moment, with the emotional pull of comparison and identity and loss aversion all active at once, the decision almost always tips toward yes. Not because the person is weak, because the moment is rigged against them. The people who break the pattern remove the moment. They make the decision once, in advance, when they are calm, thinking clearly, not standing in front of the thing they want. And then they build a structure that executes that decision automatically. This is the same principle we have discussed before in different contexts. Automated investing, automated debt payments. Here it applies to spending itself. Before the money arrives, a portion is already designated, already moved, already, in a sense, spent on the future before the present has a chance to make its case. What remains is what is available for everything else. And here is the psychological shift that makes this work. When the investing happens automatically, before you see the money, the remaining amount becomes your new normal. Not because you decided to feel that way, because that is simply what's there. The lifestyle inflation that would have crept into that automated portion never gets the chance. It is not a battle you fight every month. It is a battle you fight once when you set up the structure and then never have to fight again. Now I want to address something directly. This is not about living below your means in some extreme, joyless way. It is not about denying yourself everything that makes life enjoyable. The 10% we discussed in an earlier conversation, the portion dedicated to genuine enjoyment, still exists, still matters. The difference is sequence. Instead of spending first and seeing what's left for the future, you secure the future first and then enjoy what remains fully, without guilt. Because here is something important. Guilt-free spending, within a structure that is already protecting your future, is sustainable. Guilt-ridden spending, while telling yourself you'll save more next month, never is. The second thing that actually works is changing what you measure. Most people, when they think about their financial life, think about income. How much am I making? Did I get a raise? Is my salary competitive? But income, as we have established, is not the variable that determines whether someone builds wealth. The variable that matters is the gap, the space between what comes in and what goes out. And here is what's powerful about focusing on the gap instead of the income. The gap can be widened from both directions. You can earn more, you can spend less, or both. But more importantly, the gap is something you can actually see, track, and watch grow. Income, for most people, grows slowly and unpredictably. A raise here, a promotion there. Years between meaningful jumps. The gap can change this month. One subscription canceled, one automated transfer increased, one normal gently redefined, and watching the gap widen, even slightly, even slowly, creates something that lifestyle inflation never can, a sense of progress that is actually real, not the temporary high of a new purchase that fades within days, the quiet, compounding, permanent feeling of moving in the right direction. That feeling, once someone experiences it, tends to be more powerful than any purchase ever was, because purchases require something external. Progress is something you generate yourself. And in the final part of this conversation, we are going to talk about what this actually means for the rest of your life, and the one decision that more than any other determines which side of this pattern you end up on. Let me show you what this actually looks like over time, not in the abstract, in numbers. Because the difference between these two paths is larger than most people imagine, And the reason it's larger has everything to do with what we discussed in a previous conversation. Picture two people, same starting income, same age, same career trajectory over the next 20 years. Person A experiences the pattern we have been describing. Every raise, every bonus, every increase in income gets absorbed. The car improves, the house grows, the lifestyle expands to match. 20 years later, Person A is earning significantly more than they started with, and their bank balance tells almost exactly the same story it told 20 years ago. More income, same gap, same stress, same feeling of never quite getting ahead. Person B experiences something different, not because they earned less, not because they lived a smaller life, because somewhere early on they made one structural decision. A percentage of every increase in income before it became part of their lifestyle was redirected. Not all of it, not even most of it. Let's say half. Every raise, every bonus, half goes toward lifestyle, half goes toward the gap. In year one, the difference between Person A and Person B is barely noticeable. A few $100s a month, the kind of amount that feels almost irrelevant against the scale of a household budget. But here is where the conversation from before becomes relevant again. That few $100s a month, invested consistently, is not just sitting there, it is compounding. By year 10, Person B has not just accumulated 10 years of contributions, they have accumulated 10 years of contributions, plus the returns on those contributions, plus the returns on those returns. The snowball that we talked about is rolling. By year 20, the gap between Person A and Person B is no longer measured in thousands of dollars, it is measured in hundreds of thousands. Same income trajectory, same career, same opportunities. The only difference was what happened to each additional dollar the moment it arrived. Now here is the part of this that I think is the most important. Person B, in this scenario, did not live a deprived life. Half of every increase still went toward lifestyle. Person B still upgraded their car eventually, still moved to a nicer place, still took vacations, just slightly later, slightly more modestly, with slightly more intention. The difference between Person A and Person B was not sacrifice, it was sequence and a percentage. A decision made once about how future increases would be handled before those increases arrived, when there was no specific purchase competing for the money. And here's what I find most interesting about this. If you ask Person A and Person B, at any point along the way, how their lives felt, they would probably describe similar experiences. Both worked hard, both enjoyed their lives, both felt in the moment like they were living reasonably. The difference was invisible day to day. It only became visible over decades, which is exactly why it's so easy to miss. There's no single moment where Person A makes a bad decision and Person B makes a good one. There's just a structure, repeated hundreds of times over 20 years, versus the absence of that structure. And the absence of structure isn't a decision people consciously make. It's simply what happens by default when no decision is made at all. This is why the real reason most people stay broke isn't a single bad choice. It's the accumulation of an absent structure operating silently for decades, while life looks from the outside completely normal. In the final part of this conversation, we're going to talk about what it actually takes to become Person B, starting from wherever you are right now, regardless of what the last 20 years looked like. Let's talk about becoming Person B, starting today, regardless of what the last 10, 20, or 30 years looked like. Because I know what might be forming in your mind right now if you recognized yourself in Person A, some version of, it's too late, the last 20 years are gone, the compounding that could have happened didn't. I want to address that directly before we go any further. It's true that the 20 years that already passed cannot be recovered, but here is what's also true. The next 20 years haven't happened yet. And the mechanism we discussed, the snowball, the compounding, the gap that widens over time, doesn't care what happened before you started it rolling. It only cares about how long it rolls from here. Someone who starts this structure at 45 and lets it run for 20 years ends up in a fundamentally different position at 65 than someone who never started at all. Not as different as if they'd started at 25, but meaningfully, substantially, life-changingly different. The cost of the lost years is real, but it is a sunk cost, and sunk costs, by definition, cannot be unsunk by worrying about them. The only thing available to you, at any age, is the decision about what happens next. So let's talk about what that decision actually looks like in practice. The first element is what I'd call the raise rule. From this point forward, any increase in income, a raise, a bonus, a new client, a side income stream, gets split before it becomes part of your lifestyle, a meaningful portion. Whatever feels significant without feeling punishing gets redirected immediately, automatically, before you've had a chance to imagine what it could buy. The specific percentage matters less than the principle. The principle is this: future increases in income do not automatically become future increases in spending. That single rule, applied consistently from this point forward, is enough to start the structure that Person B benefited from. It doesn't require touching your current lifestyle at all. It only governs what happens to money you don't have yet, which makes it, psychologically, much easier to commit to than cutting your current spending. You're not giving anything up. You're simply deciding in advance what to do with something that doesn't exist yet. The second element is auditing what I'd call identity spending. Not all spending is created equal. Some spending genuinely improves your life, brings real enjoyment, real connection, real value. Other spending exists primarily to maintain an image, to signal something, to keep up with a benchmark that, as we discussed, has no ceiling. The exercise here isn't to eliminate identity spending entirely, it's to become aware of which category each expense falls into, because once you can see the difference, you often find that a surprising amount of spending falls into the second category without providing anything close to the satisfaction its cost would suggest. And here's what's interesting. When people redirect spending away from identity-driven purchases toward things that genuinely improve their daily experience, they often report feeling more satisfied while spending less. Not because they're depriving themselves, because they're spending more intentionally. The third element, and perhaps the most important, is choosing your reference point deliberately. Remember what we discussed about comparison, about the limitless benchmark created by constant exposure to other people's lives. You cannot eliminate that exposure entirely. We live in this world. But you can choose, deliberately, what you measure yourself against. Instead of measuring against an ever-shifting external standard, measure against your own gap. Is it wider this year than last year? Is the structure you put in place still running? Is the snowball still rolling? That's a comparison you can actually win, repeatedly, indefinitely. And it's the only comparison that has any bearing on where you'll actually be in 20 years. If you're still here, I want to take a moment. Because what we've talked about today isn't the kind of content that usually gets attention. It's not a hot stock tip. It's not a strategy that promises to double your money in a year. It's not even really about investing at all. It's about something quieter than that. The pattern that determines whether everything else, the investing, the compounding, the snowball, ever gets the chance to work in the first place. Most financial content skips this part entirely. It assumes you already have a gap to invest. It jumps straight to where to put the money, without addressing why, for so many people, there's nothing left to put anywhere. We didn't skip it today. We talked about lifestyle inflation and why it's not a willpower problem but an environment problem. We talked about why comparison has become limitless and why that makes the old advice to just spend less so much harder to follow than it sounds. We talked about the two trajectories, Person A and Person B, and how a single structural decision repeated for 20 years creates a gap measured not in thousands but in hundreds of thousands. And we talked about what it actually takes to become Person B starting today, regardless of what the past 20 years looked like. That's not motivational content, that's a framework. And frameworks, unlike motivation, don't fade by next week. If something in this conversation landed differently than the financial content you usually encounter, I want to invite you to stay close to this channel, subscribe, so the next conversation reaches you when it's ready. Not for hype, not for predictions, not for someone telling you what to buy this week, for the kind of understanding that compounds the way good decisions do, slowly at first, then faster. Until one day the financial pressure that once felt like a permanent feature of your life starts to feel like something you're actually moving away from. That shift is available to you, and it starts with staying close to conversations like this one. Subscribe and share this with someone who just got a raise or is about to. Someone standing at exactly the moment where the decision gets made, whether they realize it or not. And this conversation might be the difference between that raise disappearing the way every previous one did, and it becoming the first brick in something that compounds for the rest of their life. And now, let's finish what we started. Because there's one more piece of this, the piece that ties everything together. Not a number, not a percentage, not a rule, something more fundamental than any of those. The question of what you're actually building toward, and why that question matters more than any of the mechanics we've discussed. Because mechanics without a reason rarely survive contact with real life, but a reason, clear enough, personal enough, honest enough, is what makes the mechanics sustainable for the 20 years they need to run. And that's exactly where we're headed next. I want to end with something simple. Everything we discussed today, the gap, the structure, the raise rule, the two trajectories, all of it is mechanical. All of it can be set up in an afternoon, but mechanics, on their own, rarely survive 20 years. What survives 20 years is a reason. So let me ask you the question this entire conversation has been building toward. What are you actually staying broke for? I don't mean that as an accusation, I mean it literally. Every dollar that goes toward maintaining a certain image, a certain lifestyle, a certain version of normal, is a dollar that isn't going toward something else. And most people, if they're honest, can't actually name what that something else is. They've never asked. Because the spending happens automatically, the way lifestyle inflation always does. There's never been a moment to stop and ask what it's actually in service of. So here's the exercise. Not today, necessarily. Not in this moment. But soon. Sit with the question of what you're actually building toward. Not the vague answer. Not financial freedom or security in the abstract. The specific one. What would it mean for your life, 5, 10, 20 years from now, if the gap we talked about today had been widening, quietly, the whole time? What would be different? Not in terms of net worth on a statement. In terms of what you could say yes to, what you could walk away from, what you'd no longer have to think about every time you opened a bill. For some people, that answer is about time, the ability to work less, eventually, without it being a crisis. For others, it's about options, the knowledge that if something went wrong, a job loss, a health issue, an opportunity that required capital, they could handle it without it derailing everything else. For others, it's simpler than that. It's the absence of a particular kind of background tension that's been there for so long, they've stopped noticing it's there at all. Whatever your answer is. That's the thing the structure we discussed today is actually for, not the structure itself. The structure is just mechanics. It's in service of that answer. And here's why that matters. On the days when the discipline feels hard, when the raise comes in and the old pattern whispers that you've earned an upgrade, when everyone around you seems to be moving faster, the mechanics alone won't carry you through that moment. But the reason will. Because in that moment, the question isn't, can I afford this purchase? The question is this purchase worth delaying the thing I actually said I was building toward? That's a different question. And it's a question that, once you've actually answered it for yourself, tends to make these decisions much easier than they used to be. Not because you're more disciplined, but because you finally know what you're choosing between. The real reason most people stay broke isn't a lack of money or a lack of opportunity or even a lack of discipline. It's that they never stopped to ask what the money was actually for, And in that absence, it gets absorbed automatically, reasonably, one decision at a time, into a version of normal that keeps expanding without ever being asked whether it should. You don't have to let that happen anymore. The structure is simple. We covered it today. The reason is yours to find. And once you have it, the rest tends to follow. If this conversation has been worth your time, share it with someone who just got a raise or is still waiting for things to feel different once they do. Leave a comment below. Tell me what you're actually building toward, or what part of this, the gap, the structure, the reason, feels hardest to apply to your own life. Because the next conversation starts with what you need most. This is the bigger picture: money, wealth, and the life you're building. We'll see you in the next one.